The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Many of Jesus' disciples who were listening said, "This saying is hard. Who can accept it?" Since Jesus knew that his disciples were murmuring about this, he said to them, "Does this shock you? What if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit that gives life, while the flesh is of no avail. The words I have spoken to you are spirit and life, but there are some of you who do not believe." Jesus knew from the beginning the ones who would not believe and the one who would betray him. And he said, "For this reason I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted him by the Father." As a result of this, many of his disciples returned to their former way of life and no longer accompanied him. Jesus then said to the 12, "Do you also want to leave?" Simon Peter answered him, "Master, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and are convinced that you are the Holy One of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Good morning, everyone. So if you haven't heard, which I'm guessing most of you haven't, the news continues in our current scandal. And I want you to hear it here from me and not from other sources. So last night, news broke that the former ambassador from the Vatican to the United States, Archbishop Vigano, testified. He presented an 11-page formal testimony. And in that testimony, he alleges that Cardinal McCarrick is the bishop from D.C. who has been at the center of this scandal in our country. And Archbishop Vigano says that Pope Benedict had censured him, silenced him, and sent him off to do penance. He was forbidden from speaking publicly or from celebrating Mass. And he had at that time had lived at his seminary, and he was removed. And all that happened under Pope Benedict. And the allegation is that this Archbishop, Vigano, told Pope Francis about all of that, and that Pope Francis reinstated Cardinal McCarrick. That he knew about all the ugliness, all the bad things that had happened, and he removed the censure, and that Cardinal McCarrick then became perhaps the most powerful voice in terms of naming bishops in our country. I don't know if this is true. It has not yet been substantiated, but Cardinal Vigano has called for Pope Francis to resign from his office. So the scandal continues to grow. I hope this is the end of it. I don't know if it is. And I want to remind you today, I want to challenge you today, and I want to address this. How do you and I face this? Brothers and sisters, you have to know why you're Catholic. And there's only one reason to be Catholic. There's one reason and one reason alone. And the reason is because Jesus Christ founded the Catholic Church. He gave her authority. He lives within her, and he promised that he would never abandon us. And that's the only reason to be a Catholic. I love Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict is, if you go to Lourdes, you know that I like to quote him. Pope Benedict is one of my favorite people on earth. He has one of the most brilliant minds in the modern world. He is a man of deep holiness. He's a powerful example for me. But I'm not a Catholic for Pope Benedict. I never was, I never will be. If Pope Benedict, I don't think that anything will ever touch him in terms of scandal. But if it did, it would not affect me. Because I was never a Catholic for Pope Benedict. I'm only a Catholic because of Jesus Christ. And because of that, I will never leave the Catholic Church. I will do my best for the rest of my life, however many days God grants me. I will live my life as a priest, striving to become the man I should be, and to love and serve the church as I am called to. And I want to invite you to that today. So before we move further, I just want to give you a couple of things to think about. As Catholics, we're not called to be defensive. When people are going to come at you, if they know you're Catholic, and they're going to say, how can you be a Catholic? Right? If this is true about Pope Francis, and again, I don't know if it is, but if it is, people will come at you and they'll say, how can you be a Catholic? Look at what's happening in your church. And there's two things I want to give you on that briefly. The first, the Catholic Church has never, ever taught that popes would live holy lives. The church has never taught that. The New Testament is explicit about the failings and the sins of St. Peter. It shows them upright. It doesn't hide them. The church has never taught that popes would be morally perfect. What it does teach is that Jesus Christ gave authority to the church and to the popes and to our bishops. Right? You've heard me say before, Jesus chose 12 apostles, and we heard it today in our gospel. In the end of John chapter 6, we're told that Jesus knew from the very beginning who it was that would betray him. Think about that. The day that Jesus Christ pointed to Judas Iscariot and said, come follow me, and he made him an apostle of the church, he knew that day that that's the man that would hand him over to die. The church has never promised that all of its members would be holy. That's the first thing. The second thing is this, and again, don't use this defensively, but for your own edification. Why are you a Catholic? Are you a Catholic for him? Not for me, not for Archbishop Aquila, not for Pope Francis, but are you a Catholic for Jesus Christ? Think of it this way. I tell people, imagine if this scandal, and our scandal right now is worse, but imagine if a scandal broke out where there were a bunch of doctors who committed malpractice. Imagine if we had hundreds of them. Right, there would be an outrage. People would worry about our medical schools doing their job, and that would be a legitimate question. But what they would never ask is if medicine is legitimate. Right? Maybe some people would do that, but they would be wrong. Right? None of us would say, because these doctors malpractice, therefore medicine is evil. The own standards that medicine provides would condemn those doctors. And that's exactly how we should look at this scandal. The Catholic Church has the highest, most beautiful, most demanding teachings on a moral life. And anything that sins against that means that these bishops, and please God, I hope the accusations against Pope Francis are false, but if they're true, he will stand condemned not by a secular authority, but by the teachings of the Catholic Church herself. And I believe in those teachings. And I believe in Jesus Christ. And no one who fails to live up to his teachings will make me stop believing in him and the church he founded. So how do we deal with this? I don't know if you know St. Jose Maria Escriva. You need to if you don't. St. Jose Maria Escriva he's that friend who's like, he makes you laugh and he challenges you. This morning he punched me in the face. He's in heaven now, so I don't mean that literally. But he did. And St. Jose Maria Escriva says, and he's been, I forget what year he died, but St. Jose Maria says that when there's a crisis in the world, it's always a crisis of saints. It's always a crisis of saints. God chooses to set things right through saints. But I want to read you this quote. This is the one where he just smacked me right across the face this morning. He says, whenever you see a poor wooden cross alone, uncared for, worthless, and without a corpus. You know what corpus is? Corpus is the Latin word for body. And so if you see a cross, right, this one has the body of Christ on there, a corpus. But when you see just a plain cross is what he's talking about. When you see that cross, don't forget that cross is your cross. The everyday hidden cross, unattractive, unconsoling. The cross that is waiting for the corpus it lacks. And that corpus must be you. When we see ugliness, when we see a cross, brothers and sisters, there's a cross in our church right now that doesn't have a body on it. And the place on that cross is yours, and it's mine. The easy thing to do right now is to say, someone else can become holy. Someone else can deal with this. But my challenge and my invitation to you today is that when you see that cross, you see this scandal in the church, which is a cross right now, that's your cross. And you're called to embrace it. In our second reading today, I thought, isn't it providential? Lord, I love the way in these moments that you always provide. Our second reading today is that reading that lectors hate to get, especially the guys. Poor Michael. I always feel bad for the guys. The guys have to get up and say, women, be subordinate to your husbands. And they're like, do I really have to read this? If we had more time, I would love to talk about that. I love to talk about how obedience in the Christian life is not a negative thing. The world was saved by an act of obedience, right? When we are obedient to each other, we imitate him. And that's why Paul says what he does. And there's more to that, but we don't have time for that. But did you hear our reading? Our reading isn't mostly about that today. Our second reading from Ephesians 5 is about the love of Jesus Christ for his bride, the church. And so Paul says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Did you hear that? Jesus knew everything. He knew this scandal would happen. He knew all the sins of the world. And what did he do? Did he stand back and rebuke her and say, do this and that and that? And of course he challenges her. But no, he loved her. Jesus loved the church, and he gave his life for her. He saw an empty cross without a corpus on it, and he embraced it. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Why? That he might sanctify her Right? God went to the cross. Jesus suffered because he loved. And that's my invitation to you. One of my favorite stories, brothers and sisters, in moments like this, there's a decision. And maybe, and not maybe, God will do this. God, when there are dark times, it's at those moments he calls those who love him out of mediocrity into holiness. And maybe in the providence of God, maybe in his love for you, maybe he will use this dark moment for you to finally become the saint you were always destined to be. And God always does that. In dark moments, he doesn't fix everything, but he raises up men and women of great holiness. When the Roman Empire is collapsed and civilization is falling apart, he raises up St. Benedict and St. Scholastica. And they don't know that they're going to save Western civilization. They don't know that. They just love Jesus. And they choose holiness. When the papacy is corrupt, when Rome is filled with sin and ugliness, St. Catherine of Siena arises and purifies the church by her holiness. And she did not know that she would do that. She didn't know that. She just loved Christ. And in a dark moment, she said, Jesus, I am yours. In the Reformation, when Western civilization is being cut in half and the world's falling apart, if I were God, what I would do is I would fix everything. But that's not what he did. God's answer to the Reformation was a young man who was injured in battle, a nobody, who was laying in a hammock and had no dream of fixing any problems in the church. But he read a book about St. Francis and St. Dominic, and he said if they could do that, if they could give up everything for the Lord, maybe I could too. And that man was St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. They were a bright light after the Reformation and brought holiness and healing to the church for centuries. But maybe my favorite, one last story. Sorry, it's going to be a long homily today. One last story. In 1917, true story, 1917, the world's falling apart. End of World War I. And in 1917, communism would come to Russia. Communism which hates God, which is intrinsically atheistic, and would bring suffering and death to millions and millions of people. And if I were God, I would say I'm going to stop communism from happening. You know what God's answer was? 3 poor kids in the middle of Portugal. 3 poor kids, 3 nobodies. In the middle of nowhere in Portugal, at a place that today we know as Fatima. That was God's answer to communism and to the century that would have more bloodshed than all centuries in human history together. God calls those who love him in times like this out of mediocrity to holiness. And that's my challenge to you, brothers and sisters. I hope and I pray, and I don't know, I hope this isn't arrogant. I love this parish with all of my heart. And I think God's done great things here, but my hope is he's just getting started. And what if 100 years from now people look back and they say, that was such a dark time for the Catholic Church? And maybe not everyone will know, but what if people in Colorado, what if people in Denver look back and they said, But there was that parish. There was that little parish, Our Lady of Lourdes. And those people reminded us that holiness is real. And in the darkness of the scandal, their light broke out and gave us hope. That's my prayer for us. It's so weird. I don't know whether to laugh or cry. I always do both, I guess. And I cry when I laugh, and I laugh when I cry. But today's time, we were doing prayer and participation, and I was like, Lord, how do I do all this? And it fits together. But brothers and sisters, the more important piece is prayer. The Christian life, to be a good Christian does not mean I read at Mass. It does not mean I'm an usher. To be a good Christian means I have faith, hope, and love in Jesus, and I am obedient to his commands. That's what it means to be a Christian. Jesus, today, give us a deeper faith. Make us men and women of prayer. Lord, when we see that empty cross, Lord, help me to pick it up. And help me to pick it up because I love. Because I love you and because I love your church. Bless our community today, Jesus. Lord, and build up within us faith, hope, and love.
Alleluia.